Daniel Carter had 15 minutes left to reach the interview that could change the rest of his life. After nearly 2 years of rejection letters and quiet failures, this was the one door still willing to open for him. But in the middle of a cold autumn rain, he saw a stranger collapse on the sidewalk. Blood running down her forehead, and no one else stopped to help. Daniel stood there for a single breath, caught between the woman bleeding in front of him and the future waiting for him 20 minutes away. He made his choice before he even finished thinking about it. He had no way of knowing that hours later, that same woman would walk into a boardroom as the chief executive of the very company that had just closed its doors on him. The city of Chicago woke up gray that morning. The kind of gray that settles into a person's chest before it ever reaches the sky. Daniel Carter opened his eyes in a small rented apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly of old radiators and rain. He lay still for a moment, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like nothing in particular, and let himself feel the weight of the day ahead before he allowed himself to move. Today was different. Today was the first interview he had landed in nearly 2 years, and he intended to walk into that building looking like a man who still believed in himself, even if some mornings he barely did. He rose and pulled his one good suit from the closet, a charcoal gray piece he had bought 7 years earlier when his life had looked entirely different. He had pressed it the night before with careful, almost reverent attention, running the iron slowly over the same crease until it sat perfectly straight. He buttoned the jacket in front of a small mirror propped against the wall and practiced the words he planned to say, adjusting his tone until it sounded less like hope and more like confidence. On the kitchen table behind him sat a small stack of unopened bills, their envelopes edged with red reminders he had stopped opening weeks ago. He glanced at them once, then looked away, because some mornings a man has to choose which truths he lets in. He had once been an engineer with a promising career, the kind of young man whose name got mentioned in meetings before he even walked into the room. A string of misfortunes had taken that life apart piece by piece. A company that folded, a severance that ran out faster than promised, a market that seemed to have no place left for a man his age, with his particular set of skills. Since then, he had worked as a delivery driver, a warehouse loader, and for 6 months, a night janitor in a building not unlike the one he was about to walk into for his interview. None of it had broken him. Not completely, though it had worn him down in the quiet way that debt and disappointment tend to wear down even strong men. He had been widowed several years earlier, a loss that had reshaped the rhythm of his days long before the financial troubles ever arrived. And though he rarely spoke of it, the quiet discipline he carried through every hardship since seemed to trace back to that single, defining grief. He had learned, in the aftermath, that self-pity solved nothing, and that a man could either let sorrow calcify into bitterness, or let it teach him something about what actually mattered. He chose the second path, deliberately and repeatedly, even on mornings when it would have been far easier to choose the first. Friends, from his old engineering days, had drifted away one by one, uncertain how to sit with a man whose luck had turned so completely. And Daniel had let them go without resentment, understanding that most people simply do not know what to do with someone else's hard years. He kept his circle small, and his complaints smaller still. He whispered to his reflection before he left, the words barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. If today goes wrong, he told himself, he would be starting over from less than zero. A phrase he had used so often in his own mind that it no longer frightened him the way it once had. He picked up his umbrella, checked his resume one final time inside a plastic folder, and stepped out into the drizzle with the particular posture of a man who has learned to carry hope carefully, like something that might spill if he moved too fast. The street outside was slick and quiet, the kind of morning where the whole city seemed to be holding its breath along with him. What the people passing him on the sidewalk could not see was that Daniel was not poor because he had failed to try. He was poor because life, on more than one occasion, had simply refused to be fair to him. He had never once used his circumstances as an excuse, had never once let bitterness settle into his voice, the way it settles into so many men who have been handed the same hard years he had been handed. He believed, stubbornly and without complaint, that decency was still worth something in a world that often seemed to reward everything else instead. That belief would be tested before the sun even reached its highest point that day. Daniel boarded the train just after 7:40 in the morning, the platform crowded with the usual current of commuters moving in the practiced rhythm of people who no longer noticed each other. He found a seat near the window and watched the gray buildings slide past, rehearsing his answers one last time under his breath. Everything about the morning felt, for once, like it was going according to plan. The train ran on schedule, the rain had softened to a fine mist, and he had nearly 20 minutes to spare by the time he stepped off at his stop and began the short walk toward the glass tower where his interview was scheduled to take place. He crossed at the second intersection just as the signal changed, his mind still half rehearsing the answer to a question about leadership under pressure. It happened almost too fast to register at first. A car braking hard against the wet asphalt, tires screeching in a sound that cut through the ordinary noise of the street like something breaking. A woman crossing near the far curb was thrown off balance and fell hard onto the pavement, her body striking the ground at an angle that made several people nearby gasp and then immediately look away. Blood began to spread thin and dark across her forehead, mixing with the rain in a way that made the moment feel both urgent and strangely slow. The reaction of the street around her told its own quiet story about the world Daniel lived in. A few people stopped and stared, phones rising instinctively toward the scene as if capturing it mattered more than helping it. Others simply kept walking, heads down, umbrellas angled just enough to avoid seeing what they had already decided was not their problem. Daniel stood frozen for exactly as long as it took him to glance at his watch, the second hand ticking forward with what felt like deliberate cruelty. 10 minutes. If he stopped now, if he knelt down on that wet pavement and became responsible for a stranger's life. There was no version of the morning where he still made it to his interview on time. It was, in every sense that mattered, the first real choice of the day. The kind that reveals more about a person than 100 rehearsed answers ever could. Daniel had spent 2 years building himself back up toward this exact 15-minute window, sacrificing comfort, pride, and sleep for the chance to sit across from someone who might finally say yes to him again. And yet, here was a woman on the ground, alone, bleeding, and entirely unaware that a stranger's future was balancing on whether or not he decided to kneel beside her. The rain kept falling. The seconds kept moving. Daniel did not need very long to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when nobody important was watching. For one brief moment, something old and tired rose up inside him, a voice that reminded him exactly how much this interview was supposed to matter, how many months of quiet effort had led him to this single street corner at this single hour. It would have been easy, almost forgivable by any reasonable measure, to tell himself that someone else would surely help her, that a hospital was only a few blocks away regardless, that his own survival had to come first for once. He had told himself smaller versions of that same lie before, in smaller moments, and had always regretted the way it settled into his chest afterward, like a stone he could not put down. This time, the voice did not win. Whatever it cost him, he would rather carry the weight of a missed opportunity than the weight of having walked past a stranger bleeding in the rain. He was on his knees beside her before he had fully decided to move, his umbrella abandoned on the sidewalk, his phone already pressed to his ear as he dialed for help. He gave the dispatcher his location in a voice far steadier than he felt, then pulled off his suit jacket, the one he had ironed with such care only hours before, and pressed it gently against the wound on her forehead. He kept talking to her the entire time, low and even, telling her to stay awake, that help was coming, that she was not alone on that cold stretch of pavement. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a clock was still running, counting down the minutes until his interview would begin without him. When the ambulance arrived, Daniel did something that surprised even the paramedics loading the stretcher. He climbed in after her, giving up any last chance of making it to the interview at all, and rode beside a woman whose name he did not even know. Inside the ambulance, his phone rang and rang, the screen lighting up again and again with the Human Resources office trying to confirm his arrival. He silenced it each time without answering, his hand instead resting near the stranger's shoulder in a small, steady gesture, meant to remind her that someone was still there. At the hospital, He sat in the waiting area with his ruined jacket still damp with rain and blood, watching the clock on the wall pass the exact hour his interview had been scheduled to begin. His phone buzzed one final time, and this time, he looked. An email had arrived from the recruiter, brief and clinical in the way corporate rejections often are, informing him that his interview slot had been forfeited due to his failure to appear. Daniel read it twice, then set the phone face down on his knee and allowed himself exactly one long, quiet breath. He did not curse the morning, did not slam his hand against the plastic chair the way another man might have. He only said, mostly to himself, that at least she was still alive, and something in the plainness of that sentence settled him more than any interview offer could have. A nurse passed by a moment later and mentioned, almost in passing, that the woman he had brought in was going to be fine, that the injury looked worse than it actually was. Daniel nodded, exhaled the tension he had been carrying since the intersection, and allowed himself to feel, for the first time that day, something resembling peace. He had lost the job. He had not lost the only thing that had ever really mattered to him. He sat a while longer in that waiting room, listening to the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of machines down the corridor, turning the morning over in his mind the way a man turns over a coin he is not yet ready to put away. He thought about the version of himself that might have kept walking, the one who could have told himself the choice was reasonable, even responsible, and who would by now be sitting in a glass office answering questions about leadership under pressure. That version of himself felt distant and unfamiliar to him, almost like a stranger he had decided, quite easily, not to become. He thought too of his late wife, and of the quiet promise he had made to himself in the hardest months after losing her. That whatever life took from him, it would never take his decency along with it. Sitting there in his damp shirt with someone else's blood dried along one sleeve, he felt, oddly, that he had kept that promise rather well. A young resident eventually came by to update him on the woman's condition, mentioning that she was stable, alert, and asking questions, though still declining to give her full name to hospital staff. Daniel found this small detail strange but did not dwell on it, assuming only that she preferred privacy after such a public and undignified fall. He gathered his things, thanked the staff for their care, and prepared to leave, uncertain whether he would ever cross paths with the woman again in a city as large and indifferent as Chicago. It was only as he stood to go that a nurse mentioned the woman had asked, specifically, whether the man who rode in with her might stay just a little longer. Daniel sat back down without hesitation and waited. The woman came around several hours later, in a curtained room down the hall, blinking against the fluorescent light, with the disoriented calm of someone piecing together a memory in fragments. She gave no name to the nurses, offered no details beyond the basics required for her chart, and asked instead to see the man who had ridden with her in the ambulance. When Daniel stepped inside, she studied him for a long moment before speaking, her eyes sharp despite the bandage taped along her hairline. Her first question was not a thank you, not yet, but something closer to suspicion sharpened by years of learning not to trust kindness that arrived too easily. She asked him plainly why he had stopped to help her at all, when so many others clearly had not. Daniel considered the question seriously before answering, the way a man does when he senses that his response will matter more than he understands in the moment. He told her that today it happened to be her lying there on the pavement, and that on some other day it might just as easily have been him. He added, without any performance in his voice, that if their positions had been reversed, he could only hope someone would have been decent enough to stop for him too. Victoria Hayes said nothing for a long stretch of silence, turning his answer over in her mind, the way she turned over quarterly reports and boardroom proposals. Searching for the angle, the motive, the hidden ask, there was none. For the first time in longer than she could easily remember, someone had helped her without knowing her name, without knowing what she was worth, without expecting a single thing in return. She let the moment pass without revealing who she truly was, offering only a quiet thank you and a name that was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the whole truth. Before Daniel left the hospital that evening, she asked one more question, almost too casually, and it was his full name that she carefully, deliberately, chose to remember. Daniel walked home that night through streets slicked with rain. his ruined jacket folded over one arm, his mind circling back again and again to the interview he had missed. He told himself he did not regret it, and mostly he believed himself, though a small and human part of him ached at the thought of the life that had just closed its door on him. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, hung the stained jacket over a chair to dry, and sat for a long while at his kitchen table without turning on the lights. The bills were still there, unmoved, patient, in the way debt always is. He told himself that tomorrow he would start looking again, that this was simply one more door among many that had shut on him before. The following morning arrived quietly, without the urgency of the day before. And Daniel expected nothing more from it than the slow work of rebuilding his resume. Instead, his phone rang just after 9 o'clock, an unfamiliar number attached to a voice that introduced itself as calling on behalf of Hayes Dynamics. Daniel assumed, reasonably enough, that it was Human Resources following up to explain the previous day's cancellation, perhaps out of some belated courtesy. Instead, the voice on the line asked him a very different question, inviting him to come to the company's headquarters that same afternoon for a conversation the caller described only as important. Daniel agreed before he had fully processed what was happening, some quiet instinct telling him that this day would not resemble any other he had lived through recently. He arrived at the glass tower downtown, wearing the same charcoal suit, now cleaned and pressed once more, and gave his name to a receptionist who seemed to already be expecting him. He was led not to a small interview room but to the executive floor itself, past rows of desks where employees glanced up as he passed with an odd mixture of curiosity and recognition, as though word of something had already traveled ahead of him. When he reached the towering doors at the end of the hallway, they opened before he even had the chance to knock, and the room inside rose to its feet as one, chairs scraping softly against polished floors. Daniel had no time to ask why. A side door opened, and the same woman from the sidewalk stepped through it, no longer in torn clothing and bandaged skin, but in a tailored suit that made her presence in the room immediately, unmistakably clear. She was not simply a stranger he had helped. She was Victoria Hayes, and this was her company. Daniel stood very still, the weight of understanding arriving in slow, deliberate waves, rather than all at once. Victoria walked to the head of the long table and looked at him directly, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. She told the assembled executives, and Daniel himself, that the day before, a stranger had knelt beside her in the rain without once asking who she was. He had not asked whether she was wealthy, had not asked whether helping her might someday be worth something to him, had not paused even for a moment to calculate the cost of his own kindness. He had simply stopped, and in doing so, had reminded her of something she had almost stopped believing existed in people at all. The room absorbed her words in complete silence, broken only by the faint sound of rain still tapping against the windows high above the city. Ryan Brooks, the company's ambitious vice president, shifted in his seat near the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral, in the way of a man calculating risk before he speaks. He would later say, quietly, and only to a few trusted colleagues, that he found the entire gesture sentimental, unbusinesslike, an emotional decision dressed up as a leadership moment. Victoria, for her part, did not ask the room for permission or agreement. She simply stated, plainly and without room for negotiation, that Daniel Carter deserved a genuine opportunity within the company, not as a reward for saving her, but because of what his character had revealed about the kind of person he was. It was not gratitude driving her decision, though gratitude was certainly present somewhere beneath the surface. It was something closer to conviction. A belief she had nearly lost over years of navigating a world that so often used her position against her rather than for her. She had been flattered, courted, and manipulated by people who saw only her title and her net worth, never the woman underneath either. Daniel had offered her the rarest thing she could remember receiving in a very long time, which was simply help, freely given, expecting nothing at all in return. Linda Moore, the head of Human Resources sitting quietly near the window, made a note in the folder in front of her and said nothing, though her eyes moved thoughtfully between Victoria and the man still standing near the door. Daniel's first weeks at Hayes Dynamics were shaped almost entirely by Ryan Brooks's quiet campaign of suspicion. Ryan assigned him to projects that seemed engineered to reveal weakness rather than strength, Tight deadlines wrapped around unclear instructions, meetings scheduled to conflict with tasks that had no realistic way of being finished on time. He watched Daniel's work with the careful attention of a man building a case, certain that a former warehouse worker with a gap of 2 years on his resume could not possibly belong on this floor of the building. Daniel noticed the pattern early, but chose not to complain to anyone, not to Victoria, not to Linda, not even to himself in the quiet of his apartment at night. He simply did the work in front of him, carefully and without complaint, the same way he had carried a stranger's weight through a hospital hallway days earlier. Samuel Grant, the chairman of the board, observed all of this from a slight distance, the way older men who have seen many ambitious young executives rise and fall tend to observe things. He said little in those early weeks, though he occasionally asked Linda quiet questions about Daniel's progress. Questions that suggested more attention than his silence let on. Daniel, for his part, treated every assignment as though it were the only chance he would ever get, staying late without being asked, double-checking his work long after everyone else had gone home. He made no attempt to win favor with Victoria directly, keeping a careful, respectful distance that surprised more than one person watching closely. He wanted more than anything to earn his place through the work itself, not through the story that had brought him through the door. There were quieter moments, too, that never reached the boardroom but shaped Daniel's early days, just as much as any assignment did. A junior analyst named Peter Collins, still new enough to the company to speak plainly, once asked Daniel over lunch whether the whispers around the office bothered him, the ones that called him the charity hire, and worse behind closed doors. Daniel had only shrugged and said that a man who has already survived real hardship rarely finds office gossip to be much of a threat. He kept his head down, answered every unfair test Ryan placed in front of him with the same unhurried competence, and slowly, without ever asking for it, began to earn the quiet respect of people who had once doubted him. Linda Moore noticed this too, jotting private observations in the same folder she had opened on his first day, watching a pattern emerge that no amount of office politics could fully suppress. The turning point arrived roughly 6 weeks into his employment, when a serious security vulnerability was discovered buried deep within one of the company's core systems, the kind of flaw that could have cost the company tens of millions of dollars if left unaddressed. Panic moved quickly through the technical teams, meetings stacking on top of meetings as engineers searched for the source of the breach with mounting urgency. Daniel, quietly and without fanfare, spent 2 consecutive nights tracing the problem back to its root cause, a flaw buried in an old integration that everyone else had assumed was safely retired. He presented his findings not with triumph, but with the same steady calm he had shown on a rainy sidewalk weeks earlier, walking the senior engineers through the fix step by careful step. The company avoided catastrophic losses because one man refused to leave a problem unsolved, simply because it was not officially his to solve. He had not slept more than a handful of hours across those 2 nights, fueled mostly by vending machine coffee and the particular stubbornness of a man who had once lost everything and refused to let carelessness be the reason anyone else lost something too. When the fix finally held and the system stabilized just before dawn on the second night, Daniel sat alone in the empty office for a long moment, watching the sun rise over the Chicago skyline through the tall windows. He thought, briefly, of the interview he had missed weeks earlier, of the life he might have been living instead in some other company's building. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he felt no regret at all. Whatever this new path was turning out to be, it suited him in a way that the old one, for all its promise, never quite had. Victoria heard about the incident the following morning through a report from her technical director, who described Daniel's work with an admiration bordering on disbelief for someone so new to the team. She said nothing to Daniel directly that day, choosing instead to watch him a little more closely from across the various meetings they now shared. She noticed the way he never mentioned the 2 sleepless nights to anyone, never used the crisis as leverage for recognition or reward, and simply returned to his desk the next morning to continue the ordinary work in front of him. It was, she would later admit, the moment she stopped thinking of him as an interesting exception to her rules, and started thinking of him as someone whose judgment she trusted without needing to verify it first. Trust, for Victoria Hayes, had always been the rarest currency in her world, and Daniel had just earned an entire fortune of it without ever asking for a single cent. Ryan Brooks watched this unfold with a mixture of professional respect and personal alarm that he did his best to hide from everyone around him. The narrative he had been quietly building, that Daniel Carter was an unqualified charity case, elevated by a moment of sentimentality, no longer matched the evidence stacking up in front of the entire executive floor. Whispered conversations near the coffee station began to shift in tone, no longer questioning whether Daniel belonged in the building, but instead wondering how far his talent might actually carry him. Ryan, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, began to grow anxious in ways that would soon lead him toward a far more serious mistake than simple office politics. Ambition, when paired with fear, has a way of pushing people toward decisions they would never otherwise make. Not long after, evidence surfaced suggesting that the original vulnerability had not been a random oversight at all, but something deliberately introduced and then carelessly covered up. An internal review, led quietly by Linda Moore's department alongside outside auditors, traced the alteration back through a chain of approvals that led directly to Ryan Brooks's own team. Ryan, cornered by evidence he had not expected anyone to find, made the decision that would ultimately unravel him entirely. He attempted, in a private conversation with Samuel Grant, to suggest that Daniel himself might be responsible, painting the very man who had saved the company as the source of its near collapse. It was a desperate accusation, built on nothing but the thin hope that no one would look closely enough to disprove it. The board convened a formal meeting to address the matter directly. Gathering in the same long room where Daniel had once stood frozen with disbelief months earlier, Daniel arrived with a folder of evidence he had compiled not out of self-protection, but out of the same quiet diligence that defined every task he touched. Timestamps, access logs, and code histories laid out with careful precision. He did not raise his voice, did not point fingers with any relish, and made no attempt to humiliate the man who had tried to destroy his reputation. He said only that he wanted this company run by people who genuinely deserved to be trusted with it. Nothing more dramatic than that simple, steady statement. Ryan's face changed color as the evidence spoke for itself, the room around him growing colder with every passing second. Victoria watched from the head of the table, her expression unreadable to most of the people present, though something in her eyes softened as she watched Daniel handle the moment with such restraint. She had seen ambitious men fight for power before, had seen them lie, threaten, and posture in rooms exactly like this one more times than she cared to count. She had never seen someone hold that much leverage over another person's downfall, and choose, instead, to simply lay the truth on the table and let it speak for itself. For the first time since the day she had walked into that same room in a tailored suit, Victoria allowed herself a small, genuine smile, one that had nothing to do with strategy or performance. It was the first smile Daniel had ever seen from her that seemed to belong entirely to the woman underneath the title. In the weeks that followed Ryan's quiet departure from the company, Victoria found herself sitting across from Daniel more often than strict business necessity required. First in scheduled meetings, then increasingly in conversations that drifted comfortably away from spreadsheets and deadlines. She told him one evening, over coffee that had gone cold between them, that she had spent years growing distrustful of nearly everyone who entered her orbit. Every friendly gesture, every kind word, every offer of help had, at some point in her life, come attached to a hidden price she was expected to eventually pay. People saw her position before they ever saw her company's value before they ever considered her own, and over time, that had worn a kind of armor into her that she had stopped noticing she was wearing. Daniel listened without offering easy comfort or hollow reassurance, simply letting her words settle in the quiet space between them, the way he had once let silence settle beside a hospital bed. She told him, in the plainest words she had used with anyone in a very long time, that he had been the first person in longer than she could remember to help her, without any awareness of who she was. That fact alone, she admitted, had cracked something open in her that she had assumed was permanently closed. She said she was not entirely sure what to do with the feeling that had followed, only that she found herself looking forward to conversations with him more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her carefully guarded life. Daniel, for his part, admitted quietly that he had told himself for weeks not to read too much into her attention, aware of the vast distance between a company's chief executive and a man who had walked in off a rainy street. Neither of them rushed the moment, and neither of them tried to name it too quickly, letting it grow instead, the way trust grows between two people who have already seen each other at their most unguarded. Their connection deepened slowly across the following months, built less on grand gestures and more on the accumulation of small, honest moments neither of them had expected to matter as much as they did. They discovered they shared a similar sense of humor, dry and understated, the kind that surfaces only after two people have stopped performing for one another. Victoria found herself trusting his opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with his official role, valuing the plainness of his perspective in a building full of people who told her only what they thought she wanted to hear. Daniel, in turn, found himself less guarded than he had been in years, allowing himself, cautiously, to imagine a future that included someone beside him again. Neither used the word love in those early months, though anyone watching them closely in the hallways of Hayes Dynamics could have guessed it was already there. There was an evening, not long after the board meeting that ended Ryan's career at the company, when Victoria invited Daniel to walk with her along the river instead of taking the usual car home. The city lights reflected off the water in long, trembling lines. And for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to walk in step with one another through the cold evening air. She eventually admitted that she had tested people before, in small, quiet ways, offering opportunities to see who would take advantage and who would not. And that Daniel had never once failed a single one of those tests. Whether he realized he was being watched or not, Daniel told her, honestly, that he had never thought of their friendship as something to be tested or earned, only as something that had simply arrived, the way good things sometimes do arrive, without asking permission first. Victoria stopped walking at that, turned to face him fully, under a street lamp, and said that she was beginning to understand why the universe had arranged for her to fall directly in his path that rainy morning. Word of their growing closeness spread through the company slowly, in the careful way such things always do, met mostly with quiet approval rather than suspicion. Employees who had watched Daniel prove himself over many difficult months found it easy to root for a story that seemed, for once, entirely earned rather than given. Even Samuel Grant, usually the most reserved man in any room, remarked privately to Linda that he had not seen Victoria smile so freely in all the years he had known her. Linda agreed, adding only that some things simply cannot be manufactured by strategy or title, no matter how much power a person holds. What was happening between Daniel and Victoria belonged to neither the company nor its politics. It belonged only to them. A year passed, and Daniel Carter's name no longer needed the story of a rainy sidewalk to explain his place within the company. He had been named Director of Innovation, a title he had earned through the accumulated weight of his own decisions, rather than any favor extended to him by the woman who now sat across the boardroom table as his equal in every meeting that mattered. Victoria had, in that same year, quietly reshaped the culture of the company she led, introducing a hiring philosophy that valued a person's character before it ever glanced at their resume. She called it, simply and without much ceremony, character before resume, and it had already begun to change the kind of people who walked through the company's doors each morning. At the company's annual celebration, held in a hall strung with warm light against the deepening blue of another Chicago evening, Victoria stood before the gathered employees and spoke without notes. She told them that the day she met Daniel Carter, she had believed herself to be the fortunate one. A woman who happened to survive an accident because a stranger chose kindness over convenience. Slowly, over the months that followed, she had come to understand that the truth ran deeper than that simple gratitude. What Daniel had saved that day was not only her life on a rain-soaked street corner, but something far more fragile that she had nearly lost without realizing it. Her belief that people could still be good without a reason to be. The room fell into a warm and attentive silence as she finished speaking, and many in the audience assumed the evening story had reached its natural end. Daniel rose from his seat instead, reaching into his jacket pocket with a steadiness that betrayed none of the nervousness clearly written across his face. He walked toward her slowly, holding a small ring that caught the light of the room as he lowered himself before her, and asked, in a voice quieter than the one he had used to calm a stranger on a wet sidewalk a year earlier, whether she would finally agree to a date with him. Victoria laughed, the sound bright and unguarded in a way the room had rarely heard from her, and told him she had been waiting for that question far longer than he probably realized. They embraced there in front of the entire company, applause rising warm and sudden around them, the kind of sound that fills a room when everyone present understands they have just witnessed something rare. Samuel Grant, watching from a table near the back, raised his glass quietly to no one in particular, the closest thing to sentiment anyone had ever seen from the old chairman. Linda Moore wiped at her eyes without embarrassment. And even the newest hires in the room, the ones brought in under Victoria's new philosophy of character before resume, understood in that moment exactly what kind of company they had chosen to join. It was not a night built around numbers or quarterly performance. It was a night built around proof, offered plainly to everyone watching, that the values a company claims to hold can actually survive contact with real life. Outside the tall windows behind them, the lights of Chicago flickered on one by one against the darkening sky. Indifferent to the two people inside who had just quietly rewritten each other's futures. Somewhere beneath those same lights, on some other rain-soaked corner, another stranger was no doubt facing some smaller version of the same choice Daniel had once faced, deciding in an instant what kind of person they wanted to be when nobody important was watching. The city did not know it was still testing its people the same way it had tested Daniel Carter a year earlier, quietly, without warning, without any guarantee of reward. Most days, most people would never learn whether their choice had mattered at all. Daniel had been fortunate enough to learn exactly how far a single decent choice could travel, though even he would have made the same choice without ever knowing. A single act of kindness, offered without calculation on a cold and rainy morning, had gone on to change two lives forever, proving something neither of them had fully believed until they lived it themselves. Victoria had once measured the world in numbers, in leverage, in the careful distance she kept between herself and anyone who might want something from her. Daniel had once measured his own worth by how much the world seemed willing to give him back, and for 2 long years the answer had felt like almost nothing at all. Both of them had been wrong about what truly mattered, and both of them had been taught otherwise by a single ordinary morning neither one had planned for. Sometimes the most important door in a person's life does not open because they walk through the right one on time. Sometimes it opens because they were brave enough and good enough to stop for someone else instead.